In this video lecture, we will look now at deglutition, right, and peristalsis. Deglutition simply means swallowing of food, right? When you swallow food, basically what you are doing is you are sending food from mouth to your stomach, right? And if you look at the path, after mouth comes your pharynx, right? Then you have esophagus, right? Then you have stomach, right? So this is how food would be moved, right? And based on these three parts, we have three stages of swallowing that we would be looking at now, right? So the deglutition is simply swallowing of food, right? And which is assisted by saliva and mucus in the mouth, right? So before you swallow your food, we would be introducing a term bolus here. So bolus simply means when you chew your food, right, with the help of tongue, teeth, right, what you do is, and with the help of saliva in the mouth, the food that you eat is changed into a soft mass, a soft rounded mass, which is your bolus, right? Now that bolus you will swallow, right? So the first organ that comes when you swallow the food is pharynx, and pharynx have three parts: nasopharynx, then it has laryngopharynx, then it has oropharynx, right? We know that nasopharynx is used only for respiration, right? And oropharynx and laryngopharynx is used for digestion, for digestion as well as for respiration. Now if you look at the diagram, and based on our previous discussions, also in the previous discussion on esophagus, we have understood that there is a windpipe posterior to esophagus, right? And there is nasal cavity somewhere near, right? So we need to concentrate in this lecture, and we'll understand that food should not go into nasopharynx in the nasal cavity, or it should not go in the respiratory tract through the trachea, which is a windpipe, right? We'll understand how our body system will prevent food from entering into nasal cavity or into your respiratory tract through trachea, right? Now very quickly we'll just look at it. And the swallowing involves three stages, right? Three stages, which includes the voluntary stage, right? Voluntary means over which you have control. So voluntary stage, when food is swallowed by you, right? Now when the food is in pharynx, right, in the pharynx you have no control. When food moves from pharynx to esophagus, it's involuntary movement, you have no control over it. Now when the food is in esophagus, when it is moving in esophagus, this is again an involuntary movement, and you have no control on it. So when food moves from esophagus to your stomach, again you have no control over it. This is the third stage of swallowing, right, which is an involuntary stage, right? So swallowing involves three stages, right? The first stage, let me just take this down quickly. The first stage, I'm sorry, it's not writing. Right. The first stage is your voluntary stage, right? Your voluntary stage, when the food, right, when the food is voluntary stage, in which, like I said, bolus, right? Bolus is passed into your oropharynx, right? Oropharynx is a part of pharynx, right? Like we discussed, pharynx has three parts: nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. And laryngopharynx and oropharynx is involved in digestion, right? So food moves from, or let's call it now, from now onwards, bolus, right? So your bolus will move from mouth to your oropharynx, right? And this is your voluntary stage. Second is when the food is in pharynx, right? We call it as pharyngeal stage, right? And pharyngeal stage is the involuntary passage of bolus, right? This would be an involuntary passage right? Involuntary, I'm sorry, not involuntary passage. Yeah, let's call it involuntary passage or involuntary movement, right, of bolus from your pharynx to your esophagus, right? And remember, you have an upper esophageal sphincter, right, that regulates the movement of food from from your pharynx to your esophagus. The third is again an involuntary stage. It's again an involuntary stage when the food is moved from esophagus to your stomach, right? And remember, you have a lower esophageal sphincter in this path, right? Let me write it over, lower esophageal sphincter, right? And here, when the food moves from pharynx to esophagus, you have upper esophageal sphincter. So when food is moving from pharynx to esophagus, your upper esophageal sphincter will relax, right, allowing food to come into esophagus. And when the food moves from esophagus to stomach, your lower esophageal sphincter will relax, allowing the movement from esophagus to stomach, right? Now, let's talk about when you swallow the food and food is in oropharynx, right? Let me just rub this off. So when the food is in oropharynx, or before that, let's look into the organs that are involved, right? The organs that are involved would be the mouth, right? The mouth is involved. Then you have your pharynx, and then you have esophagus. These three organs are involved, right, in swallowing, right? So imagine when you are swallowing something, right? When you swallow something, what you basically doing is, when you swallow something, you are backward and upward against the palate. That helps you in swallowing the food. Food is helped by palate, the soft palate, and your uvula. Right now, we'll see how uvula comes into picture, and soft palate and uvula comes into picture. Right, and we need to make sure. If you look at this diagram, let me just correct this. Peristalsis. Yeah, and okay, yeah. So when you swallow the food, and like I said, you move your tongue upwards and backwards, right? Upwards and backwards when you swallow the food, right? And uvula also comes into picture. Uvula also move upwards. Right, now we'll see how uvula helps in swallowing. If you look at these diagrams, you can see that when the food is in your mouth, here you can see that this bolus, this green, light green kind of thing, this represents the bolus, right? When the food is in bolus, I'm sorry, when the bolus is in mouth, right? Before you swallow it, you can see here you have uvula, right? And here you have soft palate, and above soft palate you have nasopharynx, right? This is your nasopharynx, and we know that nasopharynx is your nasal cavity, right? So when this food is moving, right, when the food is moving in esophagus, it should not be going into nasopharynx, here in the nasopharynx, and esophagus, we have discussed this before, that esophagus is posterior to your windpipe. This is your windpipe, and posterior to it, you have esophagus. So this food should not be going into your trachea, which is your windpipe. We'll see how our body system will prevent the movement of food into your windpipe and into the nasal cavity. Right? So when food is swallowed, right, it will come into oropharynx. Right? Now in oropharynx, bolus, right? Bolus will activate the receptors. Right? When the receptors are activated, these receptors will send impulses in the medulla oblongata of your brain. Right? It will send impulses in the medulla oblongata of the brain, right, and the lower pons of your brain stem. Right? Now the returning impulses, right, the returning impulses, what they will do is the returning impulses will cause your soft palate and your uvula to move upward. Right? So when the soft palate and uvula will move upward, you can see this is your soft palate and here is your uvula. Right? And when the soft palate and uvula will move upward, it will close the nasal cavity, the nasopharynx. Right? So when the nasal cavity is closed, the food will not enter into nasopharynx. Right? So this is how your body system will prevent food from entering into nasopharynx. Now, talking about moving food into respiratory tract, because you have this opening here. Through this opening, food can enter into your respiratory tract. Right? So what happens is that with the same messages, right, with the same impulses that are coming from brain, the epiglottis, right, this epiglottis, which is a cartilage, you can see this is your epiglottis, right, this is your epiglottis. It will cover this opening, right, it will cover this windpipe, this trachea, right, like here it has covered this windpipe. So windpipe is also closed now. Now the food which is coming down into your esophagus has no chances of moving into the windpipe, the trachea. Right? So this is how food is prevented from entering into nasopharynx and your windpipe. Right? And just remember what organ in the brain is involved. It's medulla oblongata, right? Which is involved, right? And when the food, I'll just once again, when the food is in oropharynx, it will activate the receptors. When the receptors are activated, impulses are sent to the medulla oblongata and lower pons of brainstem, right? And the returning impulses will let the uvula and soft palate to move upward, right? Closing the nasopharynx. So food will not enter into nasopharynx. Now, at the same time, the epiglottis, which is a cartilage, will cover the windpipe, the trachea, right, which is your larynx. You can see this is larynx. This epiglottis will cover the larynx. So food will have no chance entering into windpipe, right? But sometimes you might feel that when you drink water, food enters into the nasal cavity, right? So this is how food is prevented from entering into nasopharynx and your respiratory tract, right? I hope this is clear. Now, let's look into when the food is in, when your food, now when the food further moves, right? And when the upper esophageal sphincter relaxes, right? This is what I'm discussing is your pharyngeal stage, right? This is your pharyngeal stage, right? In your pharyngeal stage, when the food moves into esophagus, your upper esophageal sphincter will relax, right? Letting food into esophagus, right? Now, when the food is in esophagus, we know that esophagus has voluntary contractions. Now, due to the voluntary contractions, it generates waves, right? And it is this wave, it is these waves that will propel the bolus further into the stomach, right? I have a very nice diagram that you can see here that helps you to understand the movement of food. Just enlarge it. The movement of food in esophagus, right? You can see this now. When the food is in esophagus, this is the bolus. It is in esophagus. This is the esophagus, right? So when the food is in esophagus, the upper part of the bolus, upper part of the esophagus, which is above bolus, right? Part of esophagus, or what we call it as superior to bolus, part of esophagus superior to bolus. What it will do is it will contract, right? What it will do is it will contract, right? You can see the circular muscles, right? We know that esophageal muscles esophagus is muscular, so its muscular walls contract, right? When it will contract, it will move the bolus further down, right? You can see how the muscles contracted here at this point, right? It's easy to see here, this circular muscle contracted, right? So when it will contract, you can easily understand that this something that you have here, since it's a very thin pipe, right? It would be forced downwards, right? Now at the same time, the muscles that are below, right? The muscles in the inferior part of bolus, here the longitudinal muscles, you can see here, longitudinal muscles will contract, right? When these longitudinal muscles will contract, you can see when these longitudinal muscles will contract, the wall will move outward like this. The walls will move outward, right? You can see how these walls are moving outward, right? Receiving the bolus, so that when these walls will move outward, it will make space for the coming bolus, right? So that bolus can further move in the esophagus, right? I hope this is clear. Longitudinal fibers inferior to the bolus contract, right? Which shortens this inferior section, right? Inferior means below the bolus, and pushes its wall outward, right? Like I said, it pushes these walls outward, right? So it can receive the bolus, right? Now the contractions, these kind of contractions are repeated in waves that push the food toward the stomach, right? That's what we are studying, swallowing of food, which is movement from your mouth till your stomach, right? So as the bolus approaches end of esophagus, here is the end of esophagus, right? And we have at the end of esophagus, we have a wall, we have valves, which are sphincters, which are nothing but circular muscles, right? So the lower esophageal sphincter will relax, right? And bolus moves into the stomach. Now the bolus is in stomach, and mucus secreted by, in this entire esophageal stage, mucus secreted by esophageal glands will lubricate the bolus and reduces the friction. This is what majorly esophagus do, right? Because food is not there for much time, so there is no secretion of enzymes, there is no digestion. What it does is the mucus, it secretes mucus, right? That will lubricate the bolus, which is inside the esophagus, and reduces the friction so that it can easily move further into the stomach, right? And this passage of any solid or semi-solid food takes around, right? It takes around 4 to 8 seconds, right? And very soft foods or liquids like the water you drink, it takes only 1 second to reach into your stomach, right? I hope this is clear. Just remember, the very important thing that we have understood here is that the food should not be entering into nasal cavity and should not be entering into your respiratory tract, that is your larynx. And how it is prevented, just concentrate on that, just understand that, right? That is really important here, right? Because esophagus has less to do with food, it has just mucus, right? that it secretes, which reduces the friction, and it makes its way, the way of bolus, easy, right? It will make bolus easily move into stomach, right? And understand lower esophageal sphincter and upper esophageal sphincter, right? I hope it is clear, right? Thanks.